All right. Hello, everyone. Hi, SFT supporters around the world. Thank you for joining our 4th LHAKAR series. This month, we're going to be talking about the environment in Tibet and why it's important for the future of Asia, specifically focusing on rivers and the Brahmaputra River. We have three really incredible panelists with us. We have Tenpa Gyaltsen. He is an environment research fellow at the Tibet Policy Institute. We also have with us Michael Buckley. He's a journalist and the author of Meltdown in Tibet, in which he exposes a lot of China's exploitation of the Tibetan environment. And finally, we have Jyotsna George. She is the campaigns director at SFT-India. So we're just going to jump right into the discussion. I'll start with Tenpa Gyaltsen. If you want to give us some context for this conversation that we're having and some background on why Tibet's environment is important for the future of Asia.
Yeah, I'm hearing something. So can I start? Okay.
Michael, maybe you would like to mute yourself. I think there's a lot of background sound.
How do I mute it?
On the top,
the top on the bar, there's 3 seconds.
Sure, I'll mute it. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. Tenpa, would you like me to repeat the question?
No, I can start. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, great.
I'm sure many of you know, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with why Tibet is so important. And now, many times the reason why we talk about Tibetan environment is it's because not it's just an issue for Tibetan people. It's an issue for the world in general and Asia in particular. That's because Tibetan plateau is the highest and largest plateau ever existed in geological history, some scientists say, which means it has some of the highest peaks and the longest mountain range, which makes it source of a lot of glaciers. So if you Google out and try to find out some of the highest peaks on Earth, you will find that first 100 peaks are on Tibetan plateau, which means Tibetan plateau is possibly the largest source of glaciers outside the 2 poles, and that's why we have so many rivers originating from Tibetan plateau running into India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. So that's one reason why Tibetan plateau is so important. And then there are also scientists saying that the Indian monsoon or the other Asian monsoon might be influenced by the kind of climate change or kind of change that's happening on the Tibetan plateau, might be some way influencing the timing and the intensity of the Asian monsoon. So for us here in Dharamsala, we had a very unusual winter this year, and we had a late start for the summer in a way, and there had been unseasonal rain this time. So many scientists believe that this might be something to do with the extensive glacial melt on the Tibetan plateau, or some change on the Tibetan plateau. Then again, there is thing about if you go to any country, like place like Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand, which share no geographical boundary with the Tibetan plateau, with Tibet, but still you cannot escape Tibetan rivers, and you might be away from Tibet, but you will be somehow in close contact with Tibetan rivers, and the river Selwyn, river Mekong, and Yangtze, and then you have the Yellow River and Indus and Brahmaputra. These are all Tibetan rivers, and these are the 6 greatest and most important rivers in Asia, originating and do greater service to the Asian other countries than Tibet itself in many ways. Then we have also Tibet, as I said earlier, the Tibetan plateau as the 3rd pole, which means beyond the 2 poles, North Pole and South Pole. Tibetan plateau has the largest number of glaciers, or the most accessible glaciers. When this glaciers melt, it becomes rivers, it becomes streams that flow into other Asian countries. So some way or other, Asia depends on Tibetan Plateau.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Yeah, Michael, I'm wondering if you have anything to add to that, particularly in light of your extensive experience on the ground in Tibet. You know, you've seen a lot of what's happening with the environment, particularly what China's doing. So maybe if you can add to Tenpa's response and tell us a bit about some specific projects that you've seen being carried out.
Yeah, well, I think basically, you know, the situation in Tibet is not repeated anywhere else in the world. It's unique. You only have one Tibet, and it's supplying water and nutrients and whatever downstream to a dozen different countries. So that's why it's so important, because it's the only place in the world that's doing that. There's nothing else like it in that geopolitical situation. But on the ground, what's happening in Tibet is massive exploitation coming on the heels of the railway. And the railway's been there since 2006, but the railway is expanding now. The railway's heading to Shigatse, it's heading to east to Ningxi, and where the railway goes, you get massive devastation is going to follow, particularly in the form of mining. So that is the big concern. Mining is the big concern right now, but also with the railway goes dam building, because the migrant workers that you need to build the dams, they come in, 20,000 people come into a valley, and they arrive, you know, by train, if they can. That's how they bring them in from China, the migrant workers. So, you know, the big forms of exploitation, if you, in one word, you could say it's mining. Mining, whether it's mining water, which is blue gold, mining the, you know, the hydro, if that can be called mining, and then massive exploitation of things like lithium, which is used in batteries now, very, very important. Tibet has a huge source of lithium, one of the third biggest in the world, I think. And then copper, large quantities of copper in mines like Gyama and Yalong near Chamdo. And then you've got smaller amounts of gold and silver, but these are minerals that China really wants. And if it can get them from Tibet, it's going to get them. So that is the big concern, and they don't seem to have a lot of concern for what happens when they get these minerals. They'll just go ahead and they're not concerned with environmental impact. They'll just do what they have to do to get them. And I think those concerns there, you know, pollution could happen from mining, because a lot of the mining takes place close to rivers like Yalong Sampo. And, you know, the fact that there's very little concern with waste products, you know, damage to the grasslands. That's a huge concern also, because the grasslands is a huge carbon sink, and if you damage that carbon sink, you're going to also impact the whole of Asia. I mean, we're destroying soil here on a large scale when you do mining, because, for example, copper, to get the copper, they have to dig up a seam. There could be 1 ton of rock, and they'll get 1% copper. Well, the 99% becomes garbage on the grasslands. This is going to destroy the grasslands. And the Chinese keep saying that the grasslands, damage on the grasslands is due to overgrazing. That's baloney. It's due to mining and fencing. But anyway, I'll hand it back to Tenpa to get a few more comments there.
Tenpa, do you have anything to add?
No, nothing much. I think that's a lot of information.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so Michael, I know when we've talked in the past, you've talked a lot about the large megadams that are being built inside Tibet right now, especially on the Yarlung Sampo. Can you talk a little bit about that, maybe?
Yeah, well, one thing that's happening in Tibet, they need the technology to build dams at altitude. We don't have a lot of dams actually on the plateau above 3,500 meters. There's probably a dozen. And they're smaller. They're maybe 500, 300 megawatts. But, you know, increasingly, once they master the technology that's needed to build at altitude, which is to deal with freezing cold conditions and so on, special concrete, you're going to see a dam that's going to go up to 700 megawatts or a gigawatt. Well, that's just a figure. But let's put that figure in perspective. The Nwazadu Dam on the Mekong River is 5.8 gigawatts. That is equivalent to the largest dam in the whole of Russia and the whole of the US. The largest, and that's still not the largest dam in China. But it's on the Mekong, and this is the scale of things that China can build. This is alarming. If they can build to that scale. And then we have on Brahmaputra, we have a plan for several dams at the Great Bend, which would be much bigger than that. They would be, one would be 38 gigawatts, it's right on the drawing board, and it's 44 gigawatts, double the size of the Three Gorges dam. These may never happen. We don't know. It's colossal scale that's happening here that's frightening. And, China has the technology. They have the tunneling technology. They have the dam building technology to master these dams at altitude, probably the most advanced technology in the world that they've developed. So if these things go ahead, and you're starting to see bigger and bigger dams, you've seen a 500 megawatt dam on the Yalang Sampo, Changmu Dam, this is going to completely alter the ecosystems downstream. There's no question that's going to have damage. And China builds in cascades. So you'll have 5 dams on the Jiangmu, you'll have 5 dams on the Salween, and then they'll start damming more and more, and then you'll destroy the river.
So what are some of those effects that we might see in downstream nations?
There's no end to the amount of effects you're going to see downstream because the rivers are so important. You're going to see water can be diverted from these dams, which means you've got a drop in volume. That has not happened yet, but it's on the drawing board because China's desperate for water. China controls the tap when they have a dam. They can turn it on or off whenever they feel like it, which is not a very convenient situation. But let's turn to other things like at the other end of these rivers, you have deltas. You have the biggest deltas in the world. The Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta is dependent on silt. That's basically half of Bangladesh, or a third of Bangladesh, is silt. It's coming from Tibet. And the silt is a cocktail of nutrients, mud, whatever that comes down the river, and it builds up, and if you don't have it coming down the river, it's going to start sinking. Your delta is going to start sinking. And when it sinks, you're going to get saltwater intrusion, which is going to ruin your whole crop situation with rice, wheat, whatever there is in Bangladesh that's being grown. It's a very serious situation. The silt is building up the delta. And, Bangladesh, if you look at the map, it's the biggest delta in the world. But you need the silt also for growing crops. You can't grow rice and wheat without silt. You have to use artificial fertilizer. So you start putting all this together, and it is an alarming situation for the countries downstream. Because you think of just water being blocked. It's not just water. It's fisheries, fish migration, it's silt. And I'll give you one example here where it's really serious. In Sundarbans, which straddles India and Bangladesh, there's a huge array of mangroves. Mangroves are salt resistant, they're highly salt resistant, but they're still a freshwater plant. And if they don't get the freshwater and they don't get the silt, actually they trap silt, then they will decline. And if they decline, that opens up the whole of Bangladesh and that part of India to cyclones, which is the reason that actually Bangladesh wanted to preserve the Sundarbans in the first place, because they kept having disasters with the cyclones and tidal surges. And it's been proven that these mangroves will stop those things, they'll mitigate it. But you need silt, because that's what's building under the mangroves. That's what mangroves are, they're building on silt. And if you don't get silt, then dams will block silt. 90% of silt can be blocked by a dam. The dam builders don't want the silt, they want it to go through, but they haven't figured out a way of doing that yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah, clearly this is a huge problem not only for Tibet, but for all of Asia. So Jyotsna, I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about what Tibetans inside are doing to protest this environmental destruction.
Yeah, so Tibetans have been protesting, well, since the beginning, and I think the very first example that we have seen of a Tibetan environmentalist or Tibetan environment activist is right back in the early 2000s with Tenzin Delek Rinpoche, who became such a threat for the Chinese government that they had to forcibly frame him for a bomb blast, and then they put him away. He was a community leader, and I think what his case reflects, and then since 2010, Tibetans have been protesting more frequently all across the Tibetan Plateau, not just in the Tibet Autonomous Region, but in Sichuan and Gansu and Yunnan, all over the Tibetan Plateau. Mining activities, damming activities, a lot of mineral extraction activities, especially where large chunks of the mountains are taken away. And I think what this reflects, and what's important for us to remember, is that this is very much the Chinese policies on the Tibetan plateau are very much a part of essentially their development plan for Tibet and for China, which is a new form of present-day colonialism or resource imperialism, where they take away all rights of the local people, that is the Tibetans, of the access to their land, how their land is used, who benefits from that. Tibetans have seen in the past that dams that have already been constructed, they do not benefit from that. In fact, they face severe problems. And so whenever there has been a Tibetan protest, it's been in areas where Tibetans consider their land to be sacred. And I think what we see through the protests that Tibetans have been doing, through lying down in front of construction sites, using their body as a form of protest, physically reflects that there is this very deep relationship that Tibetan people have to their landscape of being sacred. And I think the Chinese policies of mining and dam construction, everything that we've been through so far, reflects that there is a total disconnect between the Chinese government and the value system that Tibetans have vis-a-vis their land. It's kind of equivalent to how in India, for example, we have Monsanto coming in and deciding what Punjabi farmers are supposed to do with their land, and farmers then commit suicide. So it's a foreign power or a foreign company that does not understand your relationship to your land, but is there for profit and is there for gain. So in a similar way, all the Chinese affiliated companies, whether they're Canadian or otherwise, are there for profit, and the Tibetans are not benefiting from this at all. We increasingly now, especially since 2010, there have been a lot of non-violent protests, as well as many of the self-immolation protests have also taken place in areas where there has been extensive environmental degradation, systematic environmental degradation. There's been efforts by Tibetans consistently to not only protect their landscape, but also to kind of protect their way of life, to protect their cultural belief of the land being sacred. And yeah, that's about it from my side right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Michael and Tenpa, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on these broader political implications of China's environmental policies in Tibet.
If I can add a little bit on the dam thing, I think there's one important point that we left here. The Chinese government has been making, we have to be honest with the one thing, that they have been making new laws and policies to try to make the environment protection better and better. But there is somehow the environment protection is more concentrated in urban areas or the coastal Chinese area, China, not so much to the ethnic regions. That's why since Xi Jinping coming into power, Xi Jinping has allowed many of these mega dams to be constructed, which were on suspense for a while. So I fear that to reduce smog in Beijing or Chengdu or other Shanghai or big Chinese cities, China is building more and more mega dams and hydropower stations to, in a way, substitute the reduction of use of coal. So which means there will be more and more dams coming in on Tibetan rivers, and which is bad news for Tibetans. And that's why there has been a huge dam be built on the Nyakchu River, which in English we call it Yalung, which is in a way confusing with the Yalung Tsangpo, but it's not. It's the river in eastern part of Tibet, which China says will be the highest embankment, and this will have a serious impact on the ecology of that area, and because a lot of the major earthquake that happened in many parts of China were some way, scientists say, induced by these mega dams. So, and the Yalung Tsangpo, they are going to build a lot of dams on the Yalung Tsangpo, which they have already started with the 3, and then there will be more coming. And scientists believe that Yalung Tsangpo Valley is a very seismic prone region. So these dams will surely bring, might induce earthquake. And if there's an earthquake, it will cause damage to the dam, and which might cause a flash flood. And this will be a very, very serious issue for the Tibetans on the land and the other Asian countries. That's one issue. And then in case of the, as you asked about the environment policy, I think it's a very good news that China is doing something. And I think the Xi Jinping, the government led by Xi Jinping is in some way is sincere with the protection of environment. But how are they going to do it? Or how are they going to implement? It is a question. And with my research, I fear that the new environment protection law might not be strictly enforced in ethnic regions, because there's a lot of interest groups to deal with, and it might be very, very strictly implemented in proper China. Which, when I say proper China, in the urban areas in Shanghai, Beijing, where there are a lot of protests, where there are a lot of intellectuals writing about environment, and where environment protests are in a way allowed. But if you see in Tibet areas, every time there's an environmental protest, it's suppressed. So which is clear indication that environmental law might be biased. It might not be fairly and fairly implemented in Tibetan areas, and that would be a bad news for us.
Mm-hmm. Jyotsna, do you have anything to add to what he said?
Yeah, I feel given the dependence that we have, all of us, at least in the South Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, on rivers, a lot of which do originate from the Tibetan Plateau. This is not just a problem that Tibetans face. It's, on a very personal note, I'm worried about this because it's my future at stake as an Indian. My water security, where am I going to get water from that is flowing from Tibet, that is now being dammed extensively by China and also by India and also by Nepal and also by Bhutan, but extensively by China. And there is, as of today, there is no transboundary water sharing treaty across the Himalayas, where so many of the rivers of Asia do originate. So that's something that scares me, and that's something that I feel is no longer just the problem of Tibetan people, but of nearly 2 billion Asian people. So that's why at SFT India we launched a campaign recently on March 22, which was World Water Day, where we focus specifically on the Brahmaputra River, or the Yalung Sangpo as it's known in Tibet. And through this, we aim to highlight the extensive mining, damming, and water diversion projects that China has either already executed or has planned for the near future. With specifically speaking about the water diversion projects, they have finished 2 wings of the project that don't affect the Brahmaputra right now, but the 3rd wing, if I'm not wrong, very much involves the Brahmaputra River. And if they do go ahead with this plan, it would mean that a significant water flow would be diverted into mainland China, and that would affect not just India but also Bangladesh. So as an Indian, that's something that really worries me, and that's why we launched this campaign, where essentially what we are asking for is for the downstream countries to come together and jointly, multilaterally call for a transboundary water sharing treaty, so that there is a greater chance for water security in South Asia, Southeast Asia. And ideally, I think it would be great if we could also push towards like a moratorium on dam building, since Tenpa has mentioned that, you know, scientists say that on this highly earthquake-prone belt, the Himalayan region, the building of dams, whether it's China or India or Nepal, Bhutan, Pakistan, the building of dams on this zone is only going to exacerbate the consequences of an earthquake that's going to devastate us. And so I think in the long term, we also need to push for a ban on dam building, mega dam building on this region. Yeah, so we've launched a petition that's on our international website, which calls for the heads of state of the downstream countries, the 10 downstream countries, to jointly come together and call for a trans-boundary water sharing treaty. And we will be submitting this petition in the lead up to the COP21 summit that's going to happen later this year in November. So we will be submitting this in the lead up to that. And I would urge all of our viewers and people who are following us to visit our website, read through our information, share our materials, and sign the petition, because this is really something that is that affects not just the 6 million Tibetan people, but it affects all of us, and it's all of our collective future that is at stake. So I think this is a really urgent crisis that needs our attention. Yeah.
Michael and Tenpa, I'm wondering if you guys have any other suggestions for what we can do to help address this problem.
Yes. I think really the point that you want to make is that there's a moratorium required on all mega dam building, not only in Tibet, but also in India, Bhutan. I mean, this is going on across the Himalayas. It's a massive race. It's a race to bag water, and it's going to have a huge destructive impact across the Himalayas. But China's impact is much greater because of the transboundary rivers. But how are you going to, the question is, how do you stop China? They're the world leader in building megadams. And, the thing is that all of these issues are connected. It's not just the mining is separated from the dams and separated from the grasslands. They're all mixed up together. Because, for example, you look at the Yalong mine, northeast Chamdo area. It is a copper mine, and the power source for this mine is a thing called Guoduo, which is 165 megawatts. They need the dam to power up the mine, and then the mine is producing copper, and that copper makes up UHV lines, which transfer the power back at 3,000 kilometers. That's new technology. So what's really worrisome there is this new technology like UHV lines, which can transport power from Tibet all the way to East Coast China. That's fairly new, the last couple of years. And then the grasslands being destroyed for these mines. So when you destroy the grasslands, you're destroying a huge carbon sink. It's one of the biggest carbon sinks in the world, including Mongolia. So there, you're altering the whole patterns of the climate change and whatever, turn into desert. That alters your jet streams, that alters your monsoons, that alters a lot of things. So these things all go together. The question is, what can you do about it? And, unfortunately, China holds most of the cards because they're upstream. So they don't really have to deal with anyone. But, I mean, certainly you can put pressure on them. But then again, India is doing similar things with building megadams, not quite as big as the Chinese ones. But really, I think there needs to be a moratorium on megadam building. And we have to campaign to stop China destroying the grasslands as well, because that's what they're doing with the mining. The question is, how do you do that? That's, how do you put pressure on them to do that?
Tenpa, do you have any suggestions?
If I can add one thing, the impact of dam on the biodiversity is clear. Many of you must have heard about the finding of a new monkey species on the Kumbo area, and the Yanglun Tambo region, the place where Yanglun Tambo flows, is one of the richest biodiversity on Tibetan Plateau. And the building of a dam, mega dam, would submerge a large portion of land and forests, and which will have a severe impact on the species living there. So the Chinese scientists, some of Chinese scientists have actually urged the Chinese government to stop building some of the dams, and we'll see what happens there. So I think these are very, very good issues that we can really raise. These are something very new, something very recent, and the finding of a new, very ancient species. We Tibetans talk about we being a descendant of monkeys, so we can connect something like that and use that to bring something really issue to stop the building of dams, and that have impact on the Tibetans on the ground. And of course, it has the impact. It does a huge impact on the other countries like India and Bangladesh. And there's another issue you might have heard about the poisoning of a river in Tibet, on the Doka village, and that river flows into Lhasa River, which joins Yalung, and then the Yalung goes into India. And so if there are going to be a lot of dams, then there's surely going to be a lot of mining around the dams, and which means more and more poisoning of rivers. And unfortunately, then India and Bangladesh will receive a very little river, but they're also very polluted one.
Oh, Tenpa, it seems like the sound has cut out.
I think I'm done with the saying. I think.
Oh, okay. Just a bit of a lag.
Just want to add something. Just want to add something about biodiversity.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, dams pretty much destroy biodiversity because of the reservoirs of pretty stagnant water. There's nothing much can live in those waters. And biodiversity is how the planet depends on biodiversity. We get all our clothing from biodiversity. We get our drugs from different mushrooms, fungi. Everything comes from biodiversity. If you destroy the biodiversity, you're destroying your chances of survival further down the road. So, you know, in that case, dams are really destructive, and especially the ones that have big reservoirs. And as Tenpa was talking about, if you have earthquakes, those reservoirs behind dams become hydro bombs. They're very, very dangerous if they crack. It's actually happened in Nepal recently. But there wasn't, you know, the Chinese were building a dam, but it was not completed, so they didn't have the reservoir. But it would have caused a big, you know, the thing is, what China is doing is exacerbating the potential for disaster. In a lot of these countries, there's a lot more natural disasters going on. You're getting cyclones, you're getting tidal surges. India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, you had flooding. You know, there's a lot more natural disasters happening, and what China is doing is exacerbating the situation so that it gets worse. They're creating an environment where your disasters can be magnified. And this is what is really worrisome.
Yeah. Jyotsna, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I just would like to go back to the Tibetans inside Tibet and just kind of take this moment to remember how Tibetans are basically risking their lives right now inside Tibet because they have seen firsthand the kind of effect, long-term effect that these projects have had on their land, on their daily lives, on their livestock, on their water sources. There have been a lot of Tibetan musicians, singers, poets who've been writing about this, who've been arrested because they've been seen as instigating Tibetans to get together and protest. And like Michael pointed out, these are all interconnected, and this is very much a part of China's so-called development plan for Tibet. The more than 2 million Tibetans nomads who've been resettled forcibly is also part of the same plan. Mining and the dam building and the water diversion is part of the same plan to seek profit, right? And I think given the trend that we're seeing inside Tibet of Tibetans still fearlessly coming out and protecting their land, I think it just leaves no option for us in downstream countries to seriously take stock of the situation and put all of our efforts together into calling out China's bullying. They control the water source for close to 2 billion nations, and they have no accountability to any of us, any of our countries. So I really would urge everyone who's watching this and who's following us to join us and sign our petition once again and share it and take whatever actions you can to support our call for a trans-boundary water sharing treaty. And we have more sources and resources on our website which you can use to organize events in your area. And yeah, I think that given the situation, this is the least that we can do. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, thank you. We're still waiting on some questions from our live viewers, so anyone watching now, if you have some questions, you can send them in. But in the meantime, I'm just wondering if you guys have any final thoughts that we haven't touched upon yet. Particularly about, I think what Jyotsna was talking about was really interesting, that you know, this is a ploy by China to gain control over Tibet, but we're also seeing very dire effects in downstream nations.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear? Yeah, yes. One thing that China may do is use their geopolitical situation to actually intimidate the nations downstream, and we've seen this in the South China Seas, unfortunately. They've destroyed coral reefs to build up an airport. You know, they're destroying ecosystems in the South China Sea to build up their presence. Well, that could be exactly what they're going to do with Tibet, is when they have these dams in place, they have the upper hand. They can actually use that as to intimidate the nations downstream. It can be, you know, we're going to end up with battles over water. You're going to end up with, you know, wars over water. There's no question it's going to happen. It's a question of when. And unfortunately, you know, China does have the upper hand in this situation. So I don't know if a transboundary water treaty is going to really solve the issues, because it doesn't solve the issue of silt, because you still need silt to come down the river. And silt is a very serious issue, because you can't fertilize your crops unless you have the silt. And the dams, unfortunately, will block the silt most of the time. So you need a lot. I think what you really need to do is go for a moratorium on megadams. How to enforce that, I don't know, but I think this is the target that you need, is to stop, you know, damaging the rivers. If you damage those rivers, they won't come back to what they were before. Tenpa.
Yeah, I really want to add, meanwhile, I just want to add one thing is, I think I want to ask SFT and other activists to pressure Chinese government, or ask Chinese government to enforce and extend the new environmental law that has come into the community laws in year 2015. That I want these laws to be, this environmental law. These are not very bad laws. These are quite good. I want this new environmental protection law to be implemented fairly and equally into Tibet areas, just as it will be implemented in other Chinese places. If they do that, then we have a good, our Tibet, the Tibetan and the environmental situation in Tibet will be in some way in a better condition. So that's one slogan that you really SFT can call on. You know, it's very important. It's new, and this Chinese are saying talking so much about environment protection.
All right, thank you. And Jyotsna, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, thanks, Tenpa, for your suggestion, and we'll definitely go into looking at these environmental laws in more detail and see how we can work with them to get a better condition for the Tibetans who are living on these lands right now. Yeah, I want to thank everyone for coming here and sharing their knowledge with all of us, because I think this is something that really is urgent right now. Yeah, I don't want to say anything redundant. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, thank you to our three panelists. It was a really interesting discussion. And thank you to all of our viewers for taking time out of your day and listening to us talk about this issue. So please, to our audience, stay tuned in for our next LHAKAR series episode, which will be the first week of June. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.